Très bien. Bonjour à tous. Mesdames, Messieurs,
Good morning,
merci de nous
everyone,
avoir rejoints
ladies and gentlemen.
dans cette
Thank you
salle
for
pour ce
having
séminaire.
joined us here
Quelle
for this
compétitivité
seminar.
pour notre nouveau modèle de
What
croissance?
competitiveness for the new European growth model? This is the subject chosen by the employers group of the EESC. So we're going to focus on this new growth model, which is one of the major themes of the French presidency of the European Union, to produce and to create jobs to meet the challenges of the digital transition. And that is the program of the new model, which must still be defined, in fact. How can we achieve this in a Europe which reconciles the paradox between prosperity on the one hand and the future of the planet? How to guarantee the competitiveness of our companies in this transition? These are the questions we're going to try to answer this morning. This morning is going to be divided up into two roundtable sessions, essentially. One on the interior dimension of the competitiveness of the European market to unlock the full potential of the single market. The second one will look at the external dimensions of the European Union competitiveness by looking for growth relays in the external market. Each roundtable session will give rise to a Q&A session with those here present in the room, but also those online. So I would like to start off by giving the floor to the president of the EESC Employers Group, Stefano Maglia. So would you like to start?
Good morning, colleagues. Good morning to everyone. And I would like to start off first and foremost by wishing our Hungarian colleagues a good National Day, because today is your National Day. So congratulations on that. Distinguished guests, dear colleagues, good morning. It's a pleasure and an honor, and indeed, I must emphasize the word pleasure and the relief, to welcome you today to our group event organized in the context of the French presidency. When we started organizing this conference with the title, What Competitiveness Will Look Like in the New European Growth Model, nobody could have imagined the situation we are currently living in. Almost 30 years after the Balkan Wars and over half a century after Soviet troops marched into Prague and Budapest, Hungarian people unfortunately woke to the sound of war again. Putin's war is not just a clash of two worlds, but a clash between two polar sets of values. Ever since the attack, the images coming from Ukraine have been bringing back the darkest pages of history. In 2 weeks, the number of Ukrainians fleeing the war has reached practically 2 million people. And according to UNHCR, this is the fastest growing refugee crisis since the World War II. The countries that are the primary destinations for refugees, which is Hungary, Poland, Romania, Slovakia, are rapidly opening their homes for Ukrainian families. At the same time, we know all too well that we cannot allow for this crisis to be handled in a random manner. In this dark hour, our unity and our solidarity with Ukraine and the victims of this atrocious war offer some light. Ladies and gentlemen, I am strongly convinced that European prosperity is the best demonstration that our values are not only right, but also make our societies healthy and resilient. When we planned this conference, we conceived it to directly feed into the debate on the new European growth model, which, as you know, forms part of the French presidency program and was also meant to be the object of the extraordinary summit held last week in Versailles. Confronted with growing instability, strategic competition, and security threats, rightly so, our EU leaders decided to take more responsibility for our security, and to take further decisive steps towards building our European sovereignty, reducing our dependencies and designing a new growth and investment model for the years to come. Indeed, the extraordinary summit that took place last week was not explicitly focused on the new European growth model, but de facto it was, because all the items that were discussed and all the conclusions adopted are all strictly linked to designing a successful new growth and investment model for Europe, which makes our conference and our discussion today extremely relevant. Ladies and gentlemen, February the 24th has probably changed the course of European history, leading our union to a new turning point, possibly another turning point in 2 years. With COVID, it was the moment of solidarity. Today, it is that of building a more robust economic base, reducing our energy dependencies, and enhancing our defense capabilities. First, if we want to make Europe's economic base more resilient, competitive, and fit for the green and digital transitions, while leaving really no one behind, we must start by building on the strengths of our single market. I would say the most important instrument of the European Union. I firmly believe that the EU single market can be the cradle for the deployment of ambitious new technologies essential for future competitiveness. The lack of a European technological giant, the relative lack of venture capital and startups, and the difficulties of too many of our companies to scale up are some emblematic examples of this unfinished project. This is why the removal of the remaining barriers in the single market requires urgent consideration. And this is precisely the objective of our first panel today, which is titled Unlocking the Full Potential of the Single Market. Our distinguished speakers and guests, I am sure, will make in-depth reflection about this later today. However, I would like to share just some very brief thoughts. I think that the single market both requires and must facilitate the delivery of new critical infrastructure such as 6G, and be part of the EU solution in the fight against climate change, which to me is one of the major challenges we have ahead of us. However, if we want to make Europe a place of production, job creation, innovation, and technological excellence, strengthening the single market won't be enough. We also need to mobilize the necessary European and national funding to improve access to risk capital, overcome market failures, and encourage private investment and innovative projects. Our national fiscal policies will need to take into account the overall investment needs and reflect the new geopolitical situation. This is why finding a balance to our finances, to keep our finances in order, especially in high-debt countries, without affecting the need for investments, will be of utmost importance. And as you know, as the employers group, we are currently discussing this, and I strongly hope that we will see some good proposals coming from the Commission in terms of the reform of the Stability and Growth Pact. The current situation also calls for a thorough reassessment of how we ensure Europe's ability to act independently and influence globally, which is the object of our second panel, asserting Europe's place in the world. Achieving Europe's open strategic autonomy will be essential for the EU to shape its own destiny, manage the risks arising from its exposure to world trade and its possible over-reliance on its allies for security. It should start with addressing all our strategic dependencies, ranging from critical raw materials to semiconductors, imported agricultural products, Russian gas, oil, and coal imports. The conclusions adopted by the EU heads of state on Friday are, I believe, proposing valuable solutions to achieve this. The same conclusions are also looking at bolstering our defense capabilities, which brings me to my last points. Dear guests and dear colleagues, the crisis in Ukraine, like the withdrawal from Afghanistan, shows that European security cannot be left entirely to NATO and the US. Europeans expect, they already expect, and they expect even more now, the EU to guarantee security and peace. The last Eurobarometer showed that 75% of those surveyed were in favor of creating a defense and security policy. If Europe wants to continue to live in peace, it must finally build a strong foreign policy and common defense. The taboo on this discussion, I believe, has now completely vanished. There is no doubt in my mind, in fact we were discussing this yesterday, that over the past decades, I would say, we took peace for granted. We became complacent about peace, I think, in reality. And in doing that, we started to think, to feel that we needed a new purpose, a new narrative for the European Union, to reinvent the European Union. But I think the reality is that the old narrative, that of peace, must become the new narrative again. I would conclude by saying that Vladimir Putin thought that he would divide Europe with what he is doing, but I think he is uniting us all towards the mission of achieving peace again. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Merci Stefano Maglia.
Thank you, Stefano Maglia. I'd like to now give the floor to Christa Schwenk, the president of the EESC. Thank you very much, and first of all, a very good day to all. I would like to start by thanking our French colleagues for the exceptional evening we had last night. I really appreciate it, and I must say it was a pleasure to be with you.
Dear Stefano, dear colleagues, thank you very much for having me to be with you today. As you can imagine, as president of the ESC, I have not choice to be with you, but believe me, it was really nice to come back to you, to be with you, to spend a few hours with you, and it's a little bit like coming home. So I really appreciated that. Europe, and especially its businesses, have been struggling with the pandemic for 2 years now. When we saw the winter 2022 economic forecast of the European Commission, we noted some promising signs. And now we are looking forward to recovery and a more promising year. And now, since 24th of February, the situation has dramatically changed. Europe is faced with the reality of war, the war in Ukraine. And due to the Russians' unprovoked, unjustified, and barbaric aggression, Ukrainian people are suffering tremendously. Putin's attack is a severe attack not only against Ukraine, but also against Europe, against our values, against the value of freedom, of democracy, and of the rule of law. People in the neighboring countries are doing a tremendous job to help the refugees. Helping and supporting Ukraine's citizens and stopping the military aggression, I think we can all agree, is of the highest urgency and importance today. Having said this, Europe as a whole is also affected in several aspects. Defending our values, we have to be clear, comes with an economic cost. The war is likely to exacerbate the ongoing energy crisis. The EU imports around 44% of gas from Russia, and some member states facing an even higher dependence. Me, coming from Austria, we are dependent to 80% of Russian gas. So you can imagine what that means to us. Concrete steps now are needed to achieve a strategic independence of the European energy system. Urgent and joint action is needed to tackle the already high and likely increasing energy prices, turn towards renewable energy and diversity energy supplies. The recent REPowerEU proposal outlined how Europe should become independent from Russian fossil fuels, starting with gas, by diversifying the sources for gas supply, speeding up the rollout of renewable gases, and replacing gas in heating and power generation. This plan seeks to decrease EU demand for Russian gas by 2/3 by the end of 2022. The EU's trade reliance on Ukraine, Russia, and the Black Sea region will carry severe consequences, also for the EU's agri-food sector. The EU must work towards an open strategic autonomy of EU food systems, protect the European strategic food assets while ensuring that the borders are kept open. Several types of financial sanctions were imposed on Russian individuals, banks, and the Russian Central Bank. The head of the International Monetary Fund said last Sunday that a Russian default on its debt is no longer improbable. We must be fully aware financial institutions and businesses with Russian exposure will be impacted in European countries. And therefore, strengthening further the integration and the stability of financial markets has become even more important. The full extent of the fallout from the war and from the sanctions introduced as a response to the Russian aggression is hard to estimate. However, as both member states and sectors will be affected differently, solidarity and a common European response to mitigate the economic and social hardship will be key. If we take our European values seriously, and if we want those values to be taken seriously by others, we need to be prepared to pay the related costs as well. We must not forget that the recovery from the economic and social impacts of the pandemic is still in an early and fragile stage. The challenge remains to ensure a balanced recovery throughout Europe while laying down a path towards a resilient and sustainable future. The key word for Europe needs to be green, digital, inclusive, and resilient. We have to foster the necessary reforms to help Europe face the digital and green transitions, and to make Europe more competitive, sustainable, inclusive, and resilient. It cannot be overstated how important it is to implement the recovery and resilience plans effectively and fairly. We know that the green and digital transitions will require enormous investments. It is crucial that member states efficiently coordinate their economic policies, effectively address macroeconomic imbalances, and ensure sound public finances. At the same time, they must improve the quality and composition of their public investments to make the necessary financial resources available to support the sustainable and inclusive growth. Our competitiveness, in order to last, must be sustainable and lead to a model that balances economic prosperity, environmental issues, and social inclusiveness. This is why the transition to a circular economy is high on the ESC's agenda. A circular economy is a regenerative and restorative design that focuses on economic value creation and retention, tackling global environmental challenges such as climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution while yielding economic benefits. It should be seen as a business model rather than a cost. It is an opportunity to boost the competitiveness of European industry, promote sustainable economic growth, and create new jobs. Business has a substantial role to play, and the circular transition is already happening on the ground. Currently, only 8.3% of our economy achieves circularity. Catalyzing circular solutions and leadership from relevant stakeholders is Europe's best opportunity to accelerate the transitions to a circular economy. Allow me to conclude with a quote Winston Churchill said. Some people regard private enterprise as a predatory tiger to be shot. Others look at it as a cow they can milk. Not enough people to see it as a healthy horse pulling a sturdy wagon. I'm looking very much forward to continue working with all of you to increase the number of the European decision makers seeking our businesses and especially our SMEs what they are. The locomotive pulling European society towards a more economically prosperous, socially inclusive, and environmentally sustainable future. I'm aware that under the given geopolitical reality, this is easier said than achieved. Still, I'm convinced, especially against the current background, this is more needed than ever. Thank you very much for your attention.
Merci. Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, President. As we have noticed, we are speaking a great deal of Ukraine this morning. We've spoken of the conflict, the war underway there, the consequences for Europe. You know that this meeting was planned before the 24th of February, and it's quite clear that we had not foreseen the war in Ukraine. You know that these events impose themselves on us, and we observe that, in fact, the war reinforces the need for that European unity, reinforces the need for that competitiveness, and the power of the European economic and social model. I would now like to give the floor to Mrs. Sandrine Gaudin, who is Counselor for Europe of the Prime Minister Jean Castex and General Secretary for European Affairs.
Thanks for inviting me this morning. And I'm very thankful and be able to take some time and take some kind of a break in a highly loaded agenda. Ms. Chairwoman and the head of Employer Group and the head of the Chamber of Trade and Craftsmanship. Once again, thanks again for welcoming me today. And hello, everybody. Hello to all of the members of the Employer Group within ESC. It is always pleasant to work with you. And once again, this morning, this is a great opportunity for me to join you in producing those ideas in this very important context marked by European construction today more than ever. I was asked to make a presentation on a theme which I cherish most particularly, competitiveness. What type of competitiveness in this new European growth model? And this topic was well chosen because Ms. Nadia actually reminded us of the fact that this topic had been picked out in the Versailles summit, which was held last week and which should have actually focused or be mostly focused on this very nice challenge. In other words, the definition of a new European framework for growth or a new model. I will try to avoid reiterating what has already been said in the statement made in the Versailles summit on the 10th and 11th of March last, which united heads of states and governments, because I believe that you all are cognizant of the conclusions drawn during this summit. But of course, the summit was dedicated, or mostly dedicated, to another topic, which, the agenda was changed because of the consequences and the situation in Ukraine. And the topic underlying this growth model was not set aside, and I'll get back to it anyway. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, of course, is having economic, political consequences on our current actions during the EU French presidency. And we're trying to carry on with the work because this is a responsibility we need to live up to until the month of June, and we would like to really live up to that responsibility until the end. And as was said by the chairwoman of ESC, this invasion is an attack against international order and European values, and this attack and this invasion required discussions among heads of states last week. The EU was founded on an ideal based on peace and displayed its determination in reacting to the war by confirming several principles underlying the EU versus Russia and Belarus, which is siding with Russia. EU actually adopted quite a number of sanctions, and this was quite unprecedented because of the magnitude and the impact. And the EU also decided to help and support with a 500 million euros support the country with military aid, and a new important amount will be subject to decision in the next few hours, so as to carry on with the support package. And hence the major taboo will be eliminated, because this is a new dimension of EU that emerged with this support, this very firm military and very basic support given to a third country, to another country, a third party, a neighboring country under attack. And you know that last week You are probably familiar with the fact that last week heads of state also stated that Ukraine belonged to the European family, and this was important to the EU to acknowledge the fact that Ukraine's application for European membership, same as Georgia and Moldavia, should actually be taken into consideration. So the end of the war is actually a top of the list, a priority, and not membership, and the conditions are not gathered. But anyway, this type of support and this expression, with a term which is not used in diplomacy, because saying that Ukraine is a member of the European family, those are not the words we usually use in diplomacy. And this really had a great impact, a great value, and provides a new dimension to all those those different states with European perspective in the Balkan region and neighboring regions, and we'll have to materialize those statements with a very specific and effective acknowledgement. In other words, this call for belonging to this European construction in which, once again, values based on freedom and democracy are really at the core of. I'm not going to get back to the various decisions made by or within the summit and which are now being implemented this coming week. Last weekend and this morning with those new sanctions. And those new sanctions are pretty robust, and the objective is to exert optimal pressure on Russia. This is a return of tragedy, as was already said by the President of the Republic, and the return of tragedy. We cannot, set it aside, and this has to become one of our priorities during our EU presidency, and readjust the course of our presidency and we will still need to maintain some type of leadership on the future of Europe and the new growth, the new EU model, growth model, which is your topic today. And in the next few days, we'll be defining the reinforcement of our defense capacities through greater investment, and we'll also have to define the reinforcement of joint projects and foster projects that are going to be helping us in reducing our energy dependency vis-a-vis Russia. And it's also a way of thinking out our new growth model. And of course, in Versailles, we also discussed the reinforcement of our economic framework for the next few years, and how we can actually consider, or how we can identify our strategic priorities. Europe has to be more autonomous and more sovereign, more independent. As we say in France, whether we're talking about semiconductors, digital food, agro-food, raw materials, because food security actually is still a relevant issue, whereas we had thought we had overcome this problem. And the summit also made it possible for us to talk about the way we're going to be focusing on our trade policy, with a reminder according to which we need to consolidate some of the tools we're now setting up for a less naive Europe, a more assertive Europe, with a better control over the domestic market and the way which equitable competitive conditions are complied with among European conditions, European companies and all other companies that are active in the domestic market. I would also like to remind you that the Versailles Summit, and this is not just a reminder actually, this is not just a conventional reminder based on current circumstances, but anything that contributes to greater public and private investments is now a central issue, and the bank union and the capital union is still top of the list priority during our presidency and even beyond. Now, thinking about our new EU growth model is quite necessary, and that's the reason why we wanted to dedicate the summit or focus on that topic only. As was already said by the chairwoman before my presentation, the ecological transition is still crucial today, and the need for digital transformation is still relevant today, and inclusive growth is also indigenous to our various priorities and the need to reduce our dependencies. Now, this is a current and relevant issue today, and this is quite striking. All of those priorities remain relevant. We also need to think about the future of our EU growth model, which, I mean, this is something we need to do with you, EESC, because we also need to encompass all the stakeholders, because all of the various dimensions which I referred to are highly or tightly associated with your own prerogatives, and we need all of the ideas and energy sources for that purpose. You asked me to answer two different questions, and I'll do my utmost to answer those questions. The first one is related to how the EU can actually face up to the reconstruction of its economic system after lost jobs, after the COVID-19 crisis, and unleash new sources of growth. And to this very overarching question, which actually throws us back to the previous crisis, in other words, the health crisis and the consequences of the COVID crisis, which is still lasting. Now, to that question, we could actually provide a straightforward answer, at least in France. We need to review the budget rules, and allow member states to be freer and in their budgetary support and their support to the public sector. I believe that this is an important and a major issue. In other words, the budgetary framework, which is most relevant and most appropriate, so as to allow member states to invest as needed and also reduce their indebtedness. But I also believe that this issue should not give in or cave in to either in favor or against budgetary discipline or public expenditures. I think it's more complicated than people make it out to be. And the objective is the new EU growth model and the budgetary rules and macroeconomic rules. I mean, those are just the tools, the means, and talking about the means before talking about the objective is often turning things around, and we might actually be mistaken in proceeding this way. We have a colossal investment needs so as to support growth. Why? Because growth performance levels in Europe versus the United States were quite disappointing in the last few years, and we need to tackle the problem in the last few years. The GDP gap between the EU and the United States is 30%. I mean, it was dragged down by 30%, and we need to react to this. And the second observation, the needs for investments, for example, so as to reduce our energy dependence, but also our industrial dependence and our dependence on essential staple goods such as semiconductors. Well, this is going to be an investment, a guzzling process, an initiative requiring massive needs and resources. Now, I would not like to just list out negative items. We also have strengths we need to use here and harness: the size of our single market and its highly integrated dimension. And my predecessors, well, the previous speakers referred to this. The single market is an opportunity. We're not repeating this enough. We no longer pay attention to this. It's actually considered as something as a given, but we still need to strengthen this so as to be leaders in terms of regulations and in terms of EU standards. I mean, this is also a market marked by a high social protection scheme and environmental scheme, which differentiates this market from other international players. And insofar as the priorities of French presidency, quite a number of legislative texts that are going to be hopefully enabling for further progress in those two dimensions here: social protection and high environmental protection. And this model needs to be strengthened. We also need to capitalize on what differentiates us from other economic dimensions, such as China, the United States, the United Kingdom, which has become more independent. This is also something which we need to work on, perhaps on a more regular basis, so as to comfort our actions. And we've already referred to this. We have a great ability to acclimate ourselves beyond our hopes, because during the COVID crisis, the EU, which was quite destabilized by the pandemic crisis, because it lacked essential products such as masks and drugs in some of the member states, and displayed this great ability to rebound and react, and now turned into the first vaccine producer and the first world vaccine exporter and the first vaccine donor in the world. So in just 2 years, within 2 years, because unfortunately we're now celebrating the second anniversary of the COVID crisis in the world, in this complicated era, the EU is more agile and responsive and stronger than what people make it out to be. And insofar as this observation are strengths and weaknesses, of course, the first and prime challenge, of course, is to be successful in this dual ecological and digital transition, although the first challenge is to reestablish peace on the European continent. So there is no priority in those challenges. It is difficult to actually rank priorities with such a challenge here. I'm referring to stability. Now, the second challenge, of course, is to strengthen this resilience, the economic resilience in Europe. The health crisis and geopolitical crises are costly. They come with a very heavy price tag, and we realize that our dependence on raw materials is striking. This is something which we really need to solve, and this is an emergency. The idea is not to bottle ourselves up and isolate ourselves, but on the contrary, we need to open ourselves up. We need to call for partnership and open commercial strategy within Europe, and this is a strength. Why? Because we got 38 million jobs within the EU that depend on exports, and this is something which we need to focus. This trade policy, which should not be naive, but it has to be quite forceful, and has to promote a rebalancing of worldwide competitiveness, because we need to promote values through this trade policy. The third challenge, of course, is, and the chairwoman talked about it before my presentation, inclusive growth. This is a very nice word that is often used in speeches, or can be a very nice word, because it encapsulates and embraces quite a number of things that would take me a lot of time to flesh out here. This definition is difficult because it touches quite a number of things. I like the definition made by Kennedy on growth, and when I think of inclusive growth, I think of Kennedy, so to say. He was saying that growth is a tide that actually supports all the boats, and this is a nice definition, because this is what the EU would like to do by setting up a highly inclusive growth model, which all players can actually benefit from, whether we're talking about tankers, or other kinds of boats, which are quite jostled in the current crisis and the energy price increase, because this is something I'm going to be tackling right after your meeting and the opening of that conference. I would not like to ramble on with those introductory observations and give you enough time to talk amongst yourselves. But the second question you had asked me was, how can the French presidency be successful in promoting Europe for knowledge, a more industrial Europe, and a more innovative Europe? And I believe that we need to face up to, or answer the question, and the question of relying on our ability, and this ability which we're trying to roll out for the setup and the development of a legislative agenda, which is going to be supporting this objective of a knowledge-based Europe for more industrial competitiveness. This is the program of the French presidency, the question regarding European standards and the economic regulation and the digital regulation, which is also indigenous to the legislative agenda. We have a very important discussions with the European Parliament for the regulation of major digital platforms, and we hope we're going to make headway here in this respect. But tomorrow, on Wednesday, we're having an important meeting of the Environmental Ministry Cabinet, and they're going to agree on a new regulation on batteries and battery waste, which will make it possible to define a European standard, a highly ambitious European standard, so as to impose on all imported products and those electrical batteries which we need for our electrical vehicles. We need a unprecedented social and environmental standards, and I hope that this negotiation will be fruitful. It has made a headway, and I hope it is going to be generating the expected results a few hours down the line. We're also having an important discussion on what we call the carbon tax, the border carbon tax at the Ministry of Economy and Finances, and I hope we're going to be striking an agreement today. We're very close to it, and this, of course, is a major topic, so as to reestablish equitable, fair rules and competitive conditions, and our legislative agenda, of course, considers this as a major item. If this agreement is not struck today at the COFIN, we hope we're going to strike it by the end of H1. Of course, we got financing-related issues, which are, of course, the thorniest issues. I was talking about budget rules a few minutes ago and the need for all those transitions and challenges estimated by the Commission. Well, we're talking about colossal amounts here, and several thousand trillions of euros, so as to really be braced for battle and face up to all those different needs. And once again, a call for private financing in addition to public finances, of course, is quite second nature and vital. And I believe that all the headway made recently, and especially during the French presidency, so as to go to the financing with a taxonomy, for example, or the CSRD directive on extra financial reporting. All those different texts provide an important, interesting framework so as to go to private finances towards the right investments, those that support ecological transition, most especially. I believe that I'm going to stop right here. The topic is quite fascinating, all the more since, we're now experiencing a very important tragedy, because this really motivates more of a forceful and strong discussion with more specific and achievable results, because this is an emergency. We need to define the EU growth model and consolidate this model for this. For us to really get back to peace and prosperity in our very beautiful continent, and be able to be proud of this EU growth model, which is quite outlandish and idiosyncratic, which makes this European project quite honorable. This is quite an unprecedented project, and as a result, this project keeps generating some hope amongst us, and also makes it possible to really put some hair on our chest. And I wish a very good work. I'm not going to be able to stay here, but Stéphane Dupuis, my assistant, and my colleagues will be here to support you, so as to shed light on the work and provide answers which I have not provided you with. Thank you. You refer to a family, European family, and in family circles, we get back within the family circle. People get happy. And since yesterday, if my testimony is valuable, I saw quite a number of smiles among you, and this is probably a good illustration of this family notion which the president referred to. Now, I'm alone here on stage, but I'll set your minds at rest. We're now going to welcome the following people. Madame Mayati, for Internal Competitiveness, General Director of the French Bank Federation, and Monsieur Jean-Paul Toris, General Director of Savencia. And remotely, we're going to be discussing with Fabrice Le Sachet, Vice President of MEDEF and President of the SME Commission, Entrepreneurship at Business Europe. And we're also going to have Monsieur Andreas Koch, responsible for research at the European Political Research Center, and Madame Marie-Veronika Plutowski, head and for the single market application at the General Center for the Domestic Market, Entrepreneurship, and SMEs. Now, before we get started, I would like to remind you that this panel is going to be in English, German, and French, with the exception of those people who are not with us here. They can only follow this in French and English, but on the other hand, the presentations can be made in all three languages. Monsieur Le Sachet, we're going to start without any further ado. We were referring to No, I don't need the headset to talk, but I may actually need it to understand, to listen to the speakers. Can you hear me? Yes, hello? Okay, we're going to try to work it this way. Now, the single European market, 450 million market, the cradle for ambitious elements for European competitiveness for the future. However, for 3 decades and after the common market in 1983, the crucial policies such as digital policies and capital markets, which was actually remained fragmented within Europe. The lack of a European giant for technology and the lack of capital risking startups and the difficulty among companies. Well, those are just examples of this project. Now, in this, with the French presidency and the initiative to foster a new European growth model, the elimination of obstacles that have remained within the single market actually require an urgent study.
So this first roundtable contributes to the current debate on the European growth model by focusing on the factors that will determine Europe's future competitiveness. Firstly, by identifying the ways to deepen the single market, unlock new sources of growth, and contribute to the twin green and digital transitions. So, Mr. Sachet, when we look at the new transition, the companies will only succeed if public financing and the governments are on a level to organize a framework, a harmonized framework. So the first question that we would like to ask the members of the round table are, what are the specific obstacles and barriers that prevent companies from generating growth and job creation, that prevent our society from achieving the twin transitions? Well, as you have recalled, Europe is a major commercial power, 16% of the GDP, world GDP, on a par with that of the US. But Europe is still composed of very diverse economies. You spoke of the single market, but this is still a highly fragmented market. And so today it's important to see how we can better integrate, how we can create gateways between our countries, and how to give easier access to companies to our domestic markets. Once that observation is made, from a more philosophical point of view, we see that there's a real shift that has to be made from a Europe which for a number of years has been built around the consumer to a Europe of production. I'm not saying we must forget the consumers, the right to consumption, the right to competition, but we have to have ideas that take into account the major international evolutions. We said we want to be more independent, have a strategic autonomy in certain sectors. You know, for example, in the past we have not produced a lot of things on the European territory, health products, etc. So this shift from a consumption Europe to a production and consumption Europe is in the process. We've seen this awareness in a number of countries. We see the rules of competition which have evolved. We saw certain mergers that were not able to take place. For example, Siemens and Alstom. If we take the if we take the turnover of Alstom on its own and that of Siemens on its own, it's less than 4% of the Chinese giant in its market. So we don't take into account the world scale. If we take into account the world scale, then we can do things others are already doing. So we cannot continue to put our companies on an unfair competition base with the other countries. We have choices to make in terms of decarbonization, for example. So there are certain products, certain services cannot be produced elsewhere and then re-imported into our domestic market. So we have to rebalance production. We have to have a support to the, for example, the carbon border tax mechanism. There are things that we have to work on. We have to support a minimum world tax level, which was discussed at the level of the OECD. For example, we know the threats this might represent for the technical giants of the world. And then there are other long-term challenges, and this concerns the need to have the skills and competence. There's a new Erasmus program starting up on vocational training. When we speak of energy policy, we cannot speak of Europe on the subject because there's no common strategy. There's the nuclear choice, which is decarbonized, which offers a certain energy autonomy, but we're not all positioned the same in terms of Russian imports. Russia sells every year some 100 billion euros in energy products to Europe. So this has an impact on the taxonomy of Europe. We wanted nuclear energy to be integrated, and it's been called into question by a number of countries. So you see, there are, questions of convergence. And then finally, materials, strategic materials, the rare earths, the raw materials, etc., where we should have a European purchasing policy. And perhaps more broadly, we might reauthorize extraction in Europe. Let's be concrete. When we speak of the shift towards the electric vehicle, which means, in fact, we need certain materials like cobalt from the Republic of Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo. Rare earths have to come from China. So if we want to shift towards the electric vehicle and its batteries, which is going to lead us to leave one dependency to another dependency. So there's the question of technology, what private companies can do. And we need to secure the raw materials. There is a contradiction, a veritable European contradiction. We have more and more restrictive rules on due diligence rules, on reporting rules, and we are fixedly cutting ourselves off a number of markets. We spoken of the war in Ukraine, and it's happily enough, there's been a very dynamic reaction by the Western democracies, Japan, the U.S., Australia, Israel, Canada, but there are a number of countries which, from the diplomatic point of view, are not really aligned with this. There are countries which have a link with the emerging countries, that is, say, Russia and China have links with these countries, and we should not cut ourselves off from these emerging countries. We have to be highly discerning, find the right dosing between the social aspects and the need to secure raw materials which will enable us to continue to grow and prosper. So I think I've exceeded my speaking time, so I'll stop. Yes, I confirm you have. So now I'd like to give the floor to Maya Attig from the French Banking Federation. In its priorities, the French presidency aimed to ensure the financing of a more competitive and innovative economy in support of the recovery, to accelerate the pace of work on the development of financial sovereignty by advancing council on negotiations on prudential regulation of banking and insurance, as well as advancing the capital markets union, working towards banking union. What are your expectations on the subject?
Allô?
Can you hear me? Yes.
Alors, merci. Alors, tout d'abord,
Thank
je
you.
vous remercie
First of
d'avoir
all,
organisé
I would like to thank you
ce colloque
for having organized this symposium under the auspices of your organization. It's very important for us to see the vision of the stakeholders, be they the employers, consumers, employees. Why is it important that you express yourselves on these subjects? Because as Sandrine Godin said earlier, the subject of productivity is a global one for the economy. It's one that can be looked at on a sectorial basis, on a company-by-company basis, but it is a subject which underlies all of the economy, all of the public policies. So in the end, the view of the producers, the consumers, and the people who work in these companies can help us achieve the synthesis. What are the expectations of the banking industry? It's not the expectations for the banking sector as such, but rather the expectation concerning how the banking rules can serve the economy. Our hopes or demands with regards to this presidency is to show that a financial and banking sector and strong financial infrastructures underlie a stronger Europe, a Europe of stronger companies. To summarize, our main expectation would be to ensure that rules not be produced simply from a principle point of view, but that these rules have an objective to improve the financing of companies. I would start by saying that in the European Union, the financing of companies is very strong. Every month, every quarter, the central banks measure access to credit for companies, and this is very different from country to country. It might be better in France than in some countries, but generally speaking, there is good access. Access to the capital market is more complex, even if savings are high in our continent. And it's true that the savers prefer a secure return for their savings. So our expectation would be that the European rules, the prudential rules, the rules for the operating of the financial market be oriented toward companies, customers, and individuals so that they be able to find financing. Today, in elaborating the rules, we get the impression that the question of financial stability tends to predominate. So it is the role of the presidency And the institutions like yours show that we need rules that adapt to the financing system. Two examples, and I'll stop there. Residential real estate. You know that the banking rules do not it's important that they not penalize the financing of homes for consumers. There are rules on the information on real estate loans. There are very few rules on a secured approach to this. And these rules have to explain how a real estate loan is organized in some countries. Another example, for example, the non-rated companies. Here, the international rules can be very penalizing to finance companies which are not rated, and consequently, we need to adapt to that specificity and take this into account in our rules. So yes, you need rules for security, but you also need rules for infrastructure and financing. Thank you. Now we have, in fact, Mr. Torres. You are, in fact, Secretary General of Savencia in the agri-food sector. The European Commission published its Farm to Fork strategy in 2020. It aims to establish a development path that combines the upscaling of European food production, a production strategy based on agroecology, more sustainable production systems. And at the same time, the health crisis saw the emergence of the concept of food sovereignty. And the concept has been taken up during the war in Ukraine. As exporting companies of the agro-food sector, what are the obstacles to achieving the dual transition that is green and digital? Excuse me. Thank you. I think that with the health crisis first, and then with this war, we've discovered that feeding people is essential. I think that fully aware of what is taking place, I think we should have a thought for all of our Ukrainian colleagues who are in a war situation trying to feed the population. We heartily support them. And of course, at the European summit, we pronounced the word of food sovereignty. And with these populations, we have rediscovered these concepts. Unfortunately, I would say we're going to be facing several things because of this war. First of all, we're going to have shortages. Now, for Europe, which is relatively sovereign, the shortages will concern certain sectors, like certain raw materials, agricultural raw materials, like oleaginous products, sunflower seed oil, for example. But there will be a real cost impact, an extraordinary inflation in prices given the tension on world markets. You know that Ukraine represents 30% of the world cereal market. Now, we Europeans are privileged, and we speak of sovereignty here, food sovereignty. We are going to be short of certain raw materials that we're going to have to compensate by importing from certain third countries. And we're going to have to import protein products. And we're going to have to import them. What time frame? Well, today it says that today's Ukrainian harvests are in fact blocked in the Ukrainian ports by the Russians. So even the boats that are loaded cannot leave the ports. Now, as far as the international transporters are concerned, they refuse to load products in Russian ports. So even if we consider our situation in Europe privileged, more than a problem of price, there's going to be a shortage. There will be a shortage. You've heard of famines that are going to affect certain countries which do not produce their own food. There's a twofold problem. Can they be delivered, and will they be able to pay those deliveries, those food deliveries? So there is the cost of food, which is going to increase, and this was pronounced at the summit. There is all of a sudden an awareness that we are vulnerable. Now, we are in a capacity to feed the European population, but to do that, we're going to have to confront the prices, the inflation in prices. It is a real problem, but it raises the question of our place in the world. We spoke of the competitiveness of exports. Isn't our role in the world to also come to the rescue of others, those countries which have not the luck of having a rich agricultural terroir, rich soils? So this leads to a shock. You know, here we talk about the food aspect. You know that there are very ambitious and laudable proposals. We want to reduce inputs like fertilizers by 20%, reduce pesticides by 50%, go from 8% to 25% of agricultural land as producing organic, and to advance in a determined manner towards an ecological transition that everyone wants. However, the impact studies that we have done have shown that the shock and impact on our exports and the dependency that the blocs have, that is to say the American, Canadian, Mexican bloc on the one hand, well, they have another view of ecological transition. So the shock between the two would be considerable. So if we protect ourselves from imports that do not respect the same standard from the carbon point of view, this would be a minimum. But price-wise, you know that Europe and the European citizens are going to experience a very strong inflation in agricultural prices, which began before the war, and this is going to lead to an increase in costs linked to the ecological transition as well. So these costs are going to be difficult. Thank you. When you talk about you're talking about external trade rather than internal. What can I say about the internal trade? It works. The internal market works. Obviously, I would like it to work even better, but as a Frenchman, as a representative of the French agro-food industry, working with the partners that I see seated in front of me from the FNSEA and the agricultural world, we regret the over-transposition by our country within Europe. But I'm not going to speak of France. I was asked to speak of Europe. I'm speaking of market. Okay, so I would just like to remind you that the internal market works. If we look at the market shares of France, those of the European partners, we are in a market which more or less works, unless the war leads to the closure of borders, as has begun to happen in some countries with regards to cereals, to grains. I'd like to remind you as well that the first victim of the first crisis was Crimea, and that led to the embargo on the European agro-food sector, And obviously, external trade is a subject which was affected with the exception of certain spirits and wines. As of 2014, I received a phone call that our Russian business had been destroyed because of the Crimean War. The European Union has an ability to adapt and adjust, which is quite exceptional. And I think we'll continue with this. We are competitive. We cannot have an agro-food sector which is competitive without cooperation between the processing, the transformation sector, and the agro sector. We need to defend agriculture, and we need to defend the competitiveness of agriculture in Europe by avoiding non-competitive standards vis-a-vis the rest of the world. I'm an industrialist, and this is what I feel. Mr. Kopp, you are following us online. You are responsible at the Center for European Policy Studies, and you have launched a study renewing the dynamics of European integration. And for this, you have 30 personal stories from CEOs and presidents of Europe's best known industrial and technological companies. And you have demonstrated that a new program, a new agenda can deepen integration, achieve transitions in doing so, and strengthen open strategic autonomy. Can you give us some concrete examples of barriers to the cross-border economic activity in the European Union?
Good morning, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm drawn. There is a strong echo. I don't know whether you hear me well. One dimension.
Yes, we hear you fine. Yes, we hear you.
The examples I will be talking of the barriers that still exist in the internal market, is that it reduces the strategic value of the internal market that has been thrown into strong relief by the Ukraine war. This example that I'm talking about draw on a study of the European Roundtable for Industry, which contains reports of industry leadership on existing barriers. Each of them might look petty, small, and not very important, but the collective of them all is more important than some. I will come back to that at the end of giving you the example. One example that was given is about the difficulty of something mundane like marketing a pot of paint in the different European countries. And the fact is that national governments have national regulations on indoor air quality. They have different rules of how many volatile organic compound emissions are allowed within buildings. And this means that a producer who wants to serve the European market has to follow different specifications of how to sell a paint in the different European countries, associated with very costly requirements for labeling the product and for reporting how the product is labeled. Another important example I'm currently working on is that approval processes for products that are regulated for very good reasons have to be approved by a European agency, but then again by national agencies, which is very costly and an enormous barrier to innovation, which should be a central part of the new growth strategy. One example of how things have gone backward is given also in the collection of articles, and that's on the standardization of the norms for elevators. A decision by the European Court of Justice has ruled that these standards could only prescribe minimum standards, overruling an agreement that had been reached between the stakeholders in the member countries, the producers and the users, which has led to a proliferation of different specifications for the individual countries and has made the buildings more costly and innovation in the elevator industry more difficult. And the latter aspect, I think, is what is the main aspect of the remaining barriers that look small and not very important for the new growth strategy. Innovation caters to markets that have the largest size. Any fragmentation that is created by these small-looking barriers creates a disincentive for innovative activity, which taken together is the most important source for growth in the future. Thank you.
I'm sorry for the communication difficulty. I believe there were just a few problems on the line. I would like to turn to Madame Petevsky from the European Commission, and I would like to ask her to tell us about the obstacles and hurdles. I'm sorry, I'm mistaken here. I'm reading the wrong page. I would like to ask her about the actions carried out by the Commission to deepen the single market in this new paradigm with ecological and digital considerations and the tools that are being implemented to overcome the domestic hurdles. And Mr. Kopp actually referred to some examples regarding these hurdles.
Yes, good morning to everyone, and thank you very much for this invitation. It's a real pleasure to listen to this debate and also to take part in it. I think several speakers before me have already underlined that the European economy is undergoing, I would say, unprecedented transformation towards fair, green, and digital future. And this is happening all in the context, which is very challenging. We had, in the last 2 years, experienced the worst pandemic in recent time. And what I think was also very important here, that this pandemic even more accentuated the determination of Europe to go towards this new growth model, meaning green, digital, and fair. Now, the recent situation with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we could see that, of course, this is bringing again very challenging issues on the political agenda of European leaders. I'm not going to discuss here the defense dimension, which I think was very well described by previous speakers this morning, and the capability and capacity building that Europe would need to enhance in this area. But let me concentrate on what you asked me, Mr. Chairman, on the green and digital transition. Again, this moment is putting an additional reason for Europe to accelerate the energy transition in this case. We have seen debates in Versailles last week, And very clearly, I think the leaders expressed their determination to phase out the sources of energy coming from Russia, in particular oil, gas, coal. And this again will bring new dynamics into this process where we have set our future growth model. I'm in particular referring here of the decision that Europe wants to phase out, as I said, these energy sources coming from Russia by 2027. And this is, not, I would say, a very straightforward decision. It's a very responsible decision of our, it's a very straightforward decision, but not very easy decision to implement. But I think Europe is going to do it, and we are going to present the plans. The Commission was asked to present the plans in the following months, how we should do this in short term, in midterm, being obviously very much aware that there are also impacts and effects that we would need to think through and address collectively on the European level, and some of them also on the national level. So what actions concretely we have been putting on the table beyond what I was just referring to, and that came out of the last summit in Versailles? So the actions that I would say are concentrated along three axes. The first one, the green transition. Here, I think previous speakers already underlined how important it is that Europe goes and through this transition in a fair and inclusive manner, and also in a manner where the industry will find its a production place in Europe. This is very important to us when looking in the policy agenda. And this is the reason why last summer we came up with a very comprehensive set of actions or instruments and revision of our policies, which was called Fit for 55. I'm not going to go into all of these actions, but there you will see that we have been looking at different dimensions of this transition. Of course, climate policy is in the center together with the energy transition, but there are also elements to look at the global competitiveness. The Secretary General for European Affairs mentioned the carbon border adjustment measures. This is one of the important elements where we are looking also that this transition, of course, as I said, has to be fair and just, but also preserve the competitive edge of our industry. And put our international partners at the same level. Also, I think important in this context is that the Commission was looking into financing sources for this transition at that package and also earlier. So I'm talking here of several supporting investment or financing tools coming from the recovery and resilient facility, from our budget, from also funds that are going to be set up in particular to accompany this green transition. We are looking into social climate fund, that there is a proposal that French presidency is now discussing in the Council, and the Parliament also has these discussions. So we are very much aware that this transition is going to come with big investments, but also with measures that would need to be there to accompany different parts of economy. The second axe is the digital transition. There also, I think it's unprecedented dynamics, which has taken place already in the last 2 years, but also very much so in the years to come, We have their so-called digital compass, which is a sort of guiding roadmap for Europe to go through this transition, looking into different challenges, skills in particular. I think several of you have mentioned that already. That you see this transition will, of course, require adjustment of skills, reskilling, different educational profile of young people, but also re-education of certain people who, those of us who are already on the labor market, with potentially also reallocation of labor. So these are all challenges which we would like to cover under skilling in the digital compass, and we have several actions that were put in place in this respect. We have digital skills action plan. We have also European Pillar of Social Rights and its action plan. I can go into more details later. And then there is infrastructure. Infrastructure is critical element of this digital transition and also green transition. But in particular, digital transition, there I think the Commission is making unprecedented also moves to help this transition. In terms of policy framework, but also in terms of encouraging public and private investment in capacity of new networks, in production of the cutting edge and sustainable semiconductors, for example, in Europe. So that's another axe, infrastructure. The third one, business transformation. I'm not going to spend a lot of time because I'm sure there are other speakers on the panel that can go much in depth into this. But what we want to achieve here as the European objective is that take 75% of the European enterprises have taken up, say, cloud computing services, big data, artificial intelligence. I mean, these targets are there that help us to roll out actions around this axis. And the fourth emphasis in this digital compass is the emphasis on public services, where we want to roll out or help member states and also, encourage the EU level process to roll out key public services that would be available online. All this is, of course, very ambitious agenda, and right now, as Secretary General for European Affairs has mentioned already earlier this morning, the French presidency is negotiating a number of legislative proposals in this area. Just want to mention Digital Services Act or Digital Market Act, that are a sort of the framework legislation in this field that would give us a new space for the digital sphere. So just to conclude, because I know we are running out of time before we get into the discussion, I want to leave also my thoughts with the discussant and with the audience, that this time we really also need to go into the fair and inclusive dimension. It is unprecedented changes that are going to be required by all folks of society, and that is why the Commission is very much aware of that. And we are providing support, actions, financing also to go through the transition as far as it comes to the social and labor transition. I will stop here. Maybe just, if you permit me, Mr. Chairman, because I want to address a few points that Mr. Kopp was mentioning in his intervention. And that is first, that obviously, I think we have been reading into this study of the European Roundtable of Industrialists, which was very, useful study indeed, revealing how critical the single market is for competitiveness of the European industry and innovation, as you said, Mr. Kopp, of European industry. So first, I think there are several layers how to respond to these outcomes of the studies. First, I think there are potential areas where we can have more harmonization. This would be maybe the preferred way of it for everything, but we know how the European integration functions. There are areas where member states or society is not, ready to go as far as we would like to. But just take me one example. You mentioned labeling and packaging. This is certainly one of the area where you're completely right. If you're selling on the European market, then at least we need to have certain common standards, how you package your product, what are the substances that you can wrap up your product. So here, I would like to say that yes, we are looking into this already with our colleagues in DG Environment, and I think still this year the plan is to come out with revised, because there is already legislation in this field, but not ambitious enough, revised European legislation. So there's one area where we can and we will go for more harmonization. There is one area where I think we have a very useful tool already in place, and that is that member state needs to notify technical measures before they adopt them to the European Commission. And there is so-called the Single Market Transparency Directive. I'm not going to explain this, but there I personally see still a lot of potential that we collectively strengthen up this system, because that is proportionality. You see, member states, as I said, in certain areas, they will go for this. But then if they go to, protect the public interest, then we need to also have proportionality element in this. And thirdly, I'm not going to spend your time on this, but just to mention, you said that there are already, very small barriers.
Okay, she's not hearing us. She can't hear us. Hello? Well, thank you. I believe that we're now running out of time. We surpassed the 3 minutes required for this, or the time required for this presentation. We're now going to open ourselves up to the audience, because a lot of the speakers answer the questions here. But I would like to tell our friends remotely connected that they can also ask questions by raising their hands using the Zoom tool available to them. I'll kick it over to the room now, so for them to ask questions. Yes, thank you very much. Yes, please introduce yourself and where you're from. FNSEA for France, FNSEA. Now, the convergence, the tax and social convergence, is that a way of perhaps extending the single market and amplifying the single market process? Social and tax convergence. A second question, perhaps, in the same vein. Okay, let's go. Well, thank you very much. Federation for Trade and Distribution, the end of the food chain here. 3 items here. Investments are necessary, absolutely, to guarantee the dual transition, absolutely. But once again, I hear batteries, semiconductors, and other breakthrough technologies, and I don't understand why measures are not put on the table to support ecosystems, which are very strategic ecosystems, such as, for example, trade, which is has the greatest number of employees and which will need to support so as to train employees and guarantee transition. And I also am having a hard time to understand the type of measures addressed to that type of ecosystem. Okay, the cutting-edge industry, okay, but not that one. Maxime, you are the only one to have mentioned the issue regarding the more flexible rules. You talked about more flexible rules, and French presidency was focused on the outside and said we'll have to impose a rule or environmental social standards. This is to be on an equal pedestal with our external competitors. I fully agree, and I'd like to have a question. I'd like to ask a question: the reality of imposing mirror clauses to our partners, because it was already complicated some time ago. It's now even more complicated today. And finally, a very last question regarding the domestic market, which I place a great premium on. We talked about fragmentation. Fragmentation is more striking. The cost of non-Europe is more and more striking. So the European Commission was referring to the role of, notifications of national regulations. To be honest with you, in my sector, and every month we need to notify or alert the European Commission on a monthly basis regarding transposition, transplantation, or gold-plating measures regarding European convergence. I would like to call on the Commission and please be custodians for those treaties. We need the support from the Commission so as to deal with this fragmentation process. Thank you. I was a little long. A third question.
Thank you very much for this interesting debate. And I would like to, this is a question especially for Mrs. Tovsak in her role of Director General for Internal Market, Entrepreneurship and SMEs. I haven't heard any word about SMEs, and as you know, we are most of the market. My question is very focused. Since the last 3 years, we have been talking about digital transition and green transition. For digital transition, we have done and we have advanced. But for digital transition, I don't know if there are any plans, any programs, any that are arrived to the companies and the small and micro, because never the micro are in the map. And for this, if we take this into account, we need to know how are these going on, because for green transition, any real life we can see. Thank you.
La question s'adressait à Madame.
Now the question is addressed to Ms. Tovsak. Now a question on green digital transition for SMEs, now domestic markets, and the cost of the European standard. Do we need to make those rules more flexible right now in the tax, social, and convergence? This is part of the tools. Madame Tovsak-Petevsky, perhaps a brief answer in 2 minutes.
Thank you. Sorry, since I was a bit long last time, but I just wanted to reply to the previous speakers very shortly. SMEs obviously are the core of our economy, and I think the EU is putting quite a lot of focus to accompany SMEs through this green and digital transition. We have a so-called Invest EU plan, where we have clustered or the plan where we are planning to support the financing of the SMEs through the green and digital transition, and that would be around 7 billion euros that are allocated for that purposes, and through financial instruments. So this would be much more when it is rolled out through the financial markets. So this is one of the angles. The second angle is that in the recovery and resilience plans, almost all member states have included also small and medium enterprises as in the plans for the reforms, and plans to support them throughout now recovery stage and also the digital transition. More broadly, we have a very active network also that supports the exchange between the SMEs, and that is European Enterprise Network. And this is the network which we want to use to reach out to SMEs and to help them with very concrete approaches, exchanges of best practices, good lessons, such as using sandboxes and other approaches to help them through the digital transition. So I would leave it at here if you give me 2 minutes, Chair.
Now, the cost of European... should we make those rules more flexible?
Coming to the social and tax. You're referring to that?
Non, non, c'est par rapport à
No, with respect to the current circumstances and the Ukraine war, should we actually focus on more flexible European rules so as to protect or better protect the European market?
Well, I think our rules have already built in a very, high degree of flexibility. So here I'm not the one who would really need to look into, changing and revising all the rules once we face the situation. I think the COVID pandemic showed that we have a number of flexibility that it has been used and is being used in different areas. We have seen that, we have used also competition rules to support the pandemic crisis. Now we are again looking into that, how to help in the current situation after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So then also, I think within the trade rules, the existing instruments give us sufficient flexibility to react and support, as you said, our companies. Just give me one example also. The food sector was discussed this morning, and here 2 weeks ago now, we had an extraordinary Agriculture Council, and in this forum, then member states decided to look into ways and models, the approaches, how to collectively respond to this situation. In short, I think, yes, you're right. We need to look into, potential potential joint instruments, joint approaches how to face this crisis, but I think this is possible within existing instruments.
And how about the social dimension and tax harmonization? Are they part of the work? Was that your question? Tax harmonization?
I think there was a question of tax harmonization and social harmonization. I'm sure that you know that these are the areas. Taxation is the area where member states, where we can take decisions on the EU level, but they need to be taken with unanimity. So this is the context in which we can continue to go for changes and support competitiveness in the single market. I think the recent agreement in the OECD has shown that even if it is difficult, I would say a formal context, the change is possible. I'm not talking about harmonization, but rather, finding a joint interest and working together to create a European space as a springboard for our companies abroad. So here, harmonization is certainly not the way that it's the easiest way, but once we have unanimity for the support, the changes there are possible. In relation to the social standards, here I think we are entering a very sensitive area, as you know, and member states have competencies in this area which they exercise and will continue to exercise. But beyond that, I think with the soft approaches which we have introduced, just take, the summit in Porto last year, I think the entire discussion of the European leaders were devoted to this social model of Europe. And here, I think we should talk about the advantages that we have as Europe, not necessarily through harmonization, but supporting each other and looking for the common approaches of coordination, of cooperation in the areas where the harmonization is not possible.
Thank you very much. Just a figure, and so far as investments, perhaps in summary, today the financial system provides households, companies, European households for current standardization processes in daily investment, long-term and medium-term investments. 2 billion euros per workday. Now, if you just want to note it down, insofar as transitions are concerned, ecological, environmental transitions, and digital transitions will need, depending on which estimate is in between 1.5 billion and 2.5 billion per day, per workday, in the next few years. Now, calculus here is quite simple. Either we all the financing, all the investments are just focused on those challenges, or we create new resources. And I believe that if we bear in mind the fact that we'll need to choose either transition or guarantee daily operations, this really gives us a new perspective insofar as our intellectual resources and operational resources and the way we harness those resources. So arbitration is necessary. We're not in favor of arbitrations, but if we want to increase this mass for arbitrations to be selected and not constrained, or we'll have to think about our financial structures, but other panels will focus on this topic. Any other questions? Perhaps make a few comments on what a person said regarding distribution and the agri-food, and briefly, but still, since we're now talking about digital and green transition. Now, just to make a long story short, either we accept the farm-to-fork approach, and since we cannot impose our standards to other European countries, either we accept negative growth and lose our worldwide market shares, or mirror clauses will not work. So let's be clear about this. Either we are successful in conciliating the objectives in terms of green transition with very strong investments, ma'am. And let's not set agriculture and agri-food aside in the financing of those agricultural revolutions. They're triple genetic, and we'll just have to accept the fact that we're straggling behind in the genetic aspect of seeds, amongst other things, and we'll have to accept the fact that automation and robots will become crucial in terms of competitiveness, and this will entail a very specific size so as to depreciate our private investments in robots. And it will also be quite crucial so as to maintain labor, and most especially agricultural farming activities. And we'll also have to accept the fact that agri-tech is not ready to jump in, and this will be digital a tool, and we'll have to finance this process. It exists. It's startups are using this. You got a lot of food tech and agri-tech, and we also got a lot of means around us to be able to conciliate competitiveness and sustainable development. And this is what the farm-to-fork approach is proposing through investments, the tech, digital investments, and not negative growth. Otherwise, well, impact analysis are saying that the consequences are going to be negative.
Yes, go ahead.
I'm from the German Retail Federation. I think my question goes in a very similar direction, and it's directed to the Commission. I just wonder, we have a very, very situation and a new era, which is 2.5 weeks old. Will the Commission be in a position to adapt its work program? Because I see disrupted supply chains that are very dangerous for our companies, that we have probably a global situation with recession. And you know, in recessions, companies do not invest. And at the same time, we have a work program unprecedented from the European Commission, of course, also with unprecedented challenges with regard to climate change. And I'm not questioning our overall goals, but I'm questioning the way to achieve these goals. And I believe we need a maximum of flexibility and might need some projects like Farm to Fork, for example, to be a bit more flexible, or on the timeline, or with regard to regulations. We have the due diligence and supply chain proposal for legislation that's coming up with, that will put another additional strain on companies. So how flexible will the Commission be in adapting and optimizing its work program? That's my question.
Une autre question dans la salle, au fond? Oui, monsieur?
Another question in the audience? Yes, is it working? Yes. Josep Puchero. So the food industry sector from Spain. Two concrete questions. Today we're going to talk about the competitiveness of companies. And as far as we are concerned, the scenario has radically changed because of the war situation, and this in two areas, energy and food. As far as energy is concerned, the French presidency has announced that there's going to be a whole debate on a carbon tax on imported products. And there is the whole issue of the impact of the carbon tax on energy in Europe. And then there's also the question of finding other sources of supply for gas and other energy, because today the prices are a catastrophe. This week they're catastrophical, the prices for energy. Furthermore, as far as agricultural production is concerned and the food industry, this is going to have a direct impact on exports. We've already lost the Russia market, and this despite the investments we have made over there. Then there's a question of the substitution of primary products. You spoke of oils, seeds, etc. There are alternative markets, but this year these markets suffered drought. The U.S., Latin America, and Canada. So the situation is not good. So the last Agricultural Council has left certain measures with regards to imports. We have issues like GMOs and other restrictions, but I think that these issues have to be put on the table if we don't want to lose competitiveness as a modern industry. What are we going to do this week to try to determine, in fact, a time framework, within which we want to change? There's the question of the Green Deal, the climate change, the Paris Agreement. The food sector is very much compromised as far as the future is concerned with regards to these issues. But today we have two emergency issues, energy and food. If we do not want to find ourselves in the face of an impossible inflationary situation. Thank you.
The Warsaw Enterprise Institute.
Merci de faire court.
Sorry?
Merci de...
Okay, I'm sure, closer. Yeah, sure. Warsaw Enterprise Institute, and I think all those my predecessor mentioned very important questions. The realities are definitely obscured by events of the recent weeks, and we'll see more and more of this, and I probably, as it's pertaining to French presidency, because this will be a burden on French presidency to adjust to those issues, and our long-term EU predictable plans will probably have to be rethought. One of the issues is, and I mentioned it before, this is as a lot of companies are withdrawing from Russia, some companies are still operating in Russia and actually are enlarging their activities and sometimes gaining or being rewarded by President Putin and with a larger share of the market. So this is a question for French presidency. Obviously, this is a moral question, but also a consumer's question. Shall we set a system for European companies so they will react similarly in the case of Russian aggression and our reactions, because this is getting really dangerous, that some companies are gaining the foot in Russia, the other ones withdrawing. This is unfair competition. It also strikes consumers. In my country, we see a large movement against some companies. Unfortunately, some of them are French, who are still present in Russia, and there's a call for boycotting those companies. So this is potentially another conflict within European Union, and shouldn't be addressed that by French presidency as a rule and a new norm. Thank you.
Merci. Une dernière question dans la salle?
Maybe one last question in the audience. Yes, in the back.
Merci.
Thank you. I come from the Portuguese Confederation of Farmers. I would like to know, what is the new European growth model? I have the impression that the model is old because it was designed in a totally different reality. So what is necessary to change things? What is necessary to change the CAP? You know that the CAP was designed in 2018. It survived the COVID crisis. We now have a war in Europe, so we're dealing with totally different problems. You know, the environment is extremely important, but it's also important to be able to eat, to have food. And Europe, the European Union, is faced with this challenge. And I think the Commission has that responsibility, because its countries must want to intervene in the market, but they can't. It's the Commission that has to decide. So when will the Commission do what it's supposed to do? In 3 months? Not in 3 months or 6 months. Action is needed now. So I think Mr. Cup wanted to take the floor? No, Mr. Lusachet. Mr. Lusachet, if you hear me, I'd like to summarize things. I know that a number of points were raised by the different speakers and the people who asked questions. I'd like to say something. One of the speakers spoke of the French companies in Russia. Here I'm speaking as the MEDEF. Let me say quite clearly that the French employers, the French companies, support these sanctions, obviously. And then each company is acting in response to its situation and sector. There are obligations for the employees, the local employees, the safety of the local employees. In some cases, you cannot just pack up your bags overnight. So I don't think it would be useful to look at exactly who is doing what within what time frame. Because if we speak of boycott, because that's the word I have heard in some countries, the boycott, in fact, would be the boycott of the Russian gas and oil. And I know that, from what I understand, for a number of countries who depend on Russian gas and oil do not want boycott. So I think we all have to remain united. We all Europeans have the same objective. This aggression threatens our democratic models, the state of law, and our companies for the long term. I wanted to make that point with regards to what someone said in this audience. Now, with the short and long term is concerned, there's no magic solution as far as energy is concerned to create the infrastructure necessary to become independent. What we have proposed in a pragmatic way is to modify the price structure. You know that today this is extremely dependent on gas. So what we would want is to rapidly review this. Some say it works very well. But I think that today, given the pressure of the war in Ukraine, we need to start this work there. Marie-Veronica, I would like to really thank you for what you are doing at the level of the DG Grow, because a lot is done for the SMEs, and there are some very good programs there. But at the same time, I can't allow you to say that as far as the SMEs are concerned, what is being done in Europe is only going in one direction and is good common sense. There is one subject which is a problem, and at the heart of all our battles. And this concerns, in fact, the test SMEs. You know, there are all kinds of systemic regulations. All of the tests should be done to see the impact on the SMEs. The SME tests are not done correctly. There have been studies done by Business Europe, with Euro Chambers, with SME United, to redo a study to show that these tests are not done correctly, and they don't have an evaluation of the exposure of the SMEs to regulations. The tests the companies receive all the texts, and there's a question of proportionality. So I think that here, in fact, there should be an in-depth discussion on how we re-evaluate the impact study phase. And finally, with regards to trade and commerce, yes, this is an element of sovereignty. Today, if you look at the Amazon research budget is extraordinary. Investment obviously is leverage, indebtedness, but we have to understand the margin of companies. We see that after the 2008 crisis, the question of the margins was a problem. If we want to succeed with the green transition, this is going to call for incredible investments. And for the companies to make the investments, they have to make profits, margins. So if you want to create a Europe of production, not just industrial production, but a Europe of wealth production. It's a Europe that produces economic wealth. This means more infrastructure, more industry, more trade. It involves the financial services, all of the sectors. It's an interprofessional vision. I see that Mr. Torres was smiling. Did you want to say a last word? I fully agree with my German, Spanish, Portuguese colleagues. We're going to need flexibility to be able to overcome the consequences of this crisis. And from the point of view of the ecological transition, as Mr. Le Sachet from the MEDEF said, is we have to increase the investment capacity in all sectors, and I'm happy we spoke of the food sector. Mr. Cobb, would you like to say a word in closing?
I mean, we are raising very big questions, and we have very little time. I think there is a point that leads back to our discussion of the internal market and all the bigger questions of fiscal convergence and social convergence. There is often an agreement in Brussels, and then Brussels, the Commission watches what happens in the national states, and there is hold up and there is interpretation and fragmentation. And I can only reiterate what Madame Tovsak-Peterski said on a mechanism like the single market employment task force that is a mechanism where stakeholders sit together and can sort out what kind of diversity in regulation is most helpful and most effective across the member countries. I think this is, we cannot emphasize enough how important such a mechanism is to make progress on the internal market and the bigger questions of convergence. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe Mrs. Attig, a last word in conclusion. I think that the discussion here shows the importance of having all of the different sectors and players sitting around the table to identify the subjects, and then the need to differentiate per sector, per activity, the operational solutions. And from the regulation point of view, there are a lot of things done at the private initiative. The financing sector, from all its components. Here, I think, it's important to speak here and get across to the EESC that the financial institutions are not outside of the economic system, and the investments that you companies, you employers have to implement. They are ready to envisage very complex solutions, whether they be regulatory or financing. Thank you. Perhaps Mrs. Tufsak-Plitersky, you have 1 minute, 30 seconds to conclude the round table.
Thank you very much. I don't want to abuse the time. Just to say that I think the digital and green transition are the right framework for Europe also to go through this crisis. Now, secondly, I think many of you said, yes, this is right, but we need flexibility, how this has been implemented. I don't want to go into, again, the argument and explaining that Commission understands the critical situation right now. We have regular contacts with member states, with the industry representatives in the industrial forum. But one thing is very important. We need to find common solutions in a single market and use single market as a leverage that will help us all to overcome these critical moments. This is, again, I want to refer that we have shown already, that we understand this flexibility is needed. I would just refer and not explain that our president in Versailles explained, for example, what we are going to do in the field of energy market in regard to short-term measures, mid-term measures, looking into electricity prices, looking into industry supporting industry, supporting consumers, looking into options for temporary price limits. I mean, there are things that we have already started to employ. But again, I want to stress that for Europe, we need solutions with single market, and that has proven it was the right way to go in the COVID pandemics, and that's what we are working on also now. And lastly, colossal investments, as many of you said, we have already there recovery and resilience facility and EU budget, which altogether provide 2 trillion of investments. So I will end here because here I think we can continue our panel, but thank you very much for giving me opportunity to express our point of view from Brussels. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I must now thank all of the speakers here on the stage and by video. Thank you very much. I think we can applaud them. I'm really sorry for those who are on video, but for the others, there is a coffee break upstairs. We meet back here at 11:40 for the beginning of the second roundtable session. Thank you.